This never happened to the other fella. 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 This never happened to the other fella.
Good evening, Mr. Bond fans, and welcome to the Myths of James Bond, a series where we take a look at some of the larger public misconceptions surrounding the world of 007. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the James Bond code name theory, a theory which seems to have a resurgence every few years or so, normally in the form of clickbait articles written by people with a very casual knowledge of the 007 series. The codename theory is essentially an attempt to explain why James Bond changes physical appearance from incarnation to incarnation. It proposes that James Bond is not actually a person, but a code name that MI6 use and shift around from agent to agent. So, for example, how do you explain that James Bond looks like Sean Connery in 1971, but Roger Moore in 1973? Well, of course, Sean Connery's agent retired, so Roger Moore represents a new bloke taking on the role. The theory essentially implying that James Bond is a job title, similar to M or Q, and once an agent gets too old, an employment posting goes out and a new guy is hired to take the other guy's place. This may work in the heads of people who don't know the series very well, but it really doesn't hold up to any kind of scrutiny when you look at the films a little more closely and pick up on the very deliberate moments of continuity linking most of the Bond actors together. This video will serve as a dissection of the codename theory, and I will be pointing out instances in the film series that discredit it. So, with that in mind, let's begin, shall we, with the transition from Sean Connery to George Lazenby. I don't think there's any dispute that Dr. No to You Only Live Twice represents the adventures of one man, as played by Sean Connery. Now, when Connery left the role, the producers had no intention of giving up this incredibly popular series, so they decided to recast the role with George Lazenby for the 6th Bond film on Her Majesty's Secret Service. Rather annoyingly, the series could be blamed itself for perpetuating the idea that James Bond is a code name. In the first few minutes of the new actor's tenure, he utters this line in response to a potential conquest running away.
This never happened to the other fella.
That line is often held up as an example of why the codename theory works. Lazenby's character is acknowledging that there was a guy before him, and I mean, yeah, he is, but he also isn't. It was very much intended as a fourth wall breaking joke, meant to make people laugh a little and break the ice with the new Bond. I've heard some people justify it as being a subtle reference to Prince Charming from Cinderella, holding the shoe, the girl running off and whatnot, and yeah, I guess if you hate the fourth wall breaking stuff that much, then that's a good in-world reason as any for why he says what he says, but it was always just intended as a fourth wall breaking joke. I mean, Lazenby pretty much looks dead straight into the camera as the shot ends. Besides, later on in Majesties we get more conclusive evidence that Lazenby and Connery are in fact playing the same man. Once Bond has decided that he's going to resign from MI6, we see him clearing out his desks, and artifacts we see include Honey Rider's knife, Red Grant's Garou watch, and a breathing device from Thunderball. These are all objects that Connery's Bond obtained in his travels, and as such we can deduce that Connery's Bond and Lazenby's Bond are intended as the same character. I mean, heck, Moneypenny even gets a line in where the intention is clearly to let us know that this is the same man who's been flirting with her throughout the 60s.
Darling?
James.
However, later in Majesty's Secret Service, Bond, in disguise, meets with Blofeld, a man who he met in the previous film, and yet Blofeld doesn't seem to recognise that it's James Bond, the guy who he met a couple of years ago. This has been used as evidence for the codename theory, in favour of that theory. Like, of course Blofeld wouldn't recognise Bond, he's a different bloke in this one than he was a couple of years ago, but it's really just something of an error on the filmmaker's part. They wanted to adapt Fleming's Majesty's novel as faithfully as possible, and in that book, Bond and Blofeld meet for the first time, not in You Only Live Twice like in the film series, and because the books were filmed out of order, it's just a discrepancy that we have to live with. The most significant element of continuity in the entire series occurs in this film, though, as we see James Bond marrying Tracy DiVincenzo, who is killed by Irma Bunt, passing in a car driven by Blofeld in a neck brace, and this will be a significant detail in the video later on. Once Lazenby was out of the role and Sean Connery was back in, things get a little bit complicated as the series was kind of grappling with how it was going to handle its own continuity itself. Connery returns to the series in the 7th film, Diamonds Are Forever, which opens in a rather Japanese-looking location, and given that the last Connery Bond adventure, You Only Live Twice, ended in Japan, this could be seen as a subtle rewriting of continuity, removing On Her Majesty's Secret Service from the canon. There's also this line during the briefing scene, which some have pointed to as explaining why Connery's agent was away during the events of the previous film.
You've been on holiday, I understand.
The line here is clearly intended in the same vein as Lazenby's Other Fella line, a fourth wall breaking moment and an in-joke for the audience. Not that Connery's Bond literally went on annual leave for a couple of weeks so they brought in another guy to replace him and named him James Bond. However, despite all this presumably acting in favour of the codename theory, we actually have another element at play here, which is acting against the theory, specifically the aggression with which Bond is pursuing leads to find Blofeld in the opening sequence of Diamonds Are Forever. This could be taken as a guy is really pissed off that his wife is dead and he is out for revenge against the man who masterminded it. Otherwise, why would he be so aggressive here? And while Diamonds Are Forever neglects to deal adequately with the fallout of Majesty's, the pre-title sequence does try to play it both ways. If you didn't like Majesty's Secret Service, forget about it. The guy that you liked is back in the part, and if you did like Majesty's Secret Service, then, well, here Bond is getting revenge on Blofeld for his murdered wife. After Connery once again stepped down from the role, Roger Moore would take on the part of 007, and while his first couple of movies would go by without any overt continuity besides the recurring presence of the MI6 regulars, there are moments in his third and fifth movies that certainly connect him back to George Lazenby. By The Spy Who Loved Me in 1977, it seemed that the film series was making a conscious effort to make it clear that this is in fact the same man whose wife was murdered back in the 60s.
Many lady friends, but married only once. Wife killed.
All right, you've made your point.
You're sensitive, Mr. Bond.
About certain things, yes.
And as if just to make it extra clear that yes, Anya was referring to the same wife from 1969, For Your Eyes Only very conclusively shows Bond laying flowers at the grave of Tracy Bond, and then going on to battle Blofeld, complete with, you'll notice, a neck brace.
We were looking for something a little different, and we wanted to bring Blofeld, or the reference to Blofeld, back into the Bond stories to give them a little more continuity. And we developed it for Blofeld so that he used it on his wheelchair. This was a hark back to On Her Majesty's Secret Service where he gets his neck broken, so we take it a stage further and he's in his wheelchair.
That's all well and good, Mr. Glenn, but Blofeld didn't have a neck brace on in Diamonds Are Forever, so is For Your Eyes Only writing diamonds out of the continuity? Well, maybe, or maybe not. It depends how you want to take it. And I'm talking about this element in particular because I just kind of want to make a point about how continuity in this series does not necessarily exist on a linear timeline. Different directors come in with different interpretations and they want to do their own thing, and that's fine. There are inconsistencies, but the one main consistent element is that from Sean Connery to Pierce Brosnan, James Bond is one man. In Dalton's License to Kill, we have this moment.
Is there something wrong?
He was married once, but it was a long time ago.
A clear reference to Tracy Bond, and in Brosnan's The World's Not Enough, the character of Elektra is deliberately designed to evoke memories of Tracy, to explain why Bond is falling for her so much, and again we have dialogue more than implying the past presence of a deceased wife.
Have you ever lost a loved one, Mr. Bond?
In addition to the wife, The World's Not Enough is cited as Bond's own family motto in both that film and back in On Her Majesty's Secret Service.
The world is not enough.
Foolish sentiment.
Family motto.
Good motto, eh? The world is not enough. Vivian's doing a splendid job.
And then there's also a continuing friendship with the character of Felix Leiter that spans Connery, Moore, and Dalton, unless we're to believe that Felix Leiter is an assigned name too. So unless MI6 are very specific that every man hired to fill in the role of James Bond needs to be a widower and good friends with a particular CIA agent, we can connect all of the first 5 actors who played Bond in the official series as one man. Then, when Daniel Craig takes over the series in 2006, we have a reboot. His series takes place on a new timeline, and yeah, Judi Dench is there in both the Brosnan and Craig eras, but don't let it bother you too much. She's a great actress in a great part, so who's complaining?
Christ, I miss the Cold War.
Interestingly, the video game 007 Legends seemed to suggest that Craig's Bond had experienced everything that the other Bond actors had, as part of that game's narrative takes place over flashbacks the agent is presumably having after falling off of the bridge in the pre-credits sequence of Skyfall. If this were canon, it would have meant that Craig's Bond was connected to all the others, with his first two films, Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace, representing a prequel of sorts to Dr. No, with Skyfall picking up after Die Another Day. This, of course, doesn't work on a linear timeline, unless James Bond is a Time Lord, but on the floating timeline that the series has established, it could have worked as an explanation, and it would certainly have explained why the DB5 in Skyfall has all the same gadgets that the car does in Goldfinger. Skyfall goes further than any other Bond film to establish James Bond as a man and not a code name. We see his family homestead, hear about some elements of his childhood, and even see the grave of his deceased parents. The way in which his parents were killed is also consistent with Ian Fleming's James Bond, that of a climbing accident, which was the same reason given for the death of Bond's parents in GoldenEye, and further proof that these are supposed to be the same man, just on different timelines now. Spectre quickly discredited theories that Craig's Bond could have experienced everything that the other incarnations had by changing the origins of Blofeld, making Bond his adopted brother, and giving the two a past that went back to their childhood. The film also showed us Bond and MI6 learning of the villainous organization Spectre for the very first time. So, after Skyfall teased with the idea of calling back to previous actors' incarnation, Spectre quite decisively tells us that the Daniel Craig series is indeed set aside from the other 20 movies and the 5 actors who played James Bond in that first era of Bond. Really, I think the main takeaway from this is just don't get hung up on continuity in this series. I uploaded a video covering a lot of these pre-Skyfall points nearly 10 years ago, and I was surprised that I'm still receiving comments on that video along the lines of, well, yeah, I see what you're saying, but what if James Bond is a Time Lord, or what if MI6 hire people and then brainwash them into believing they're a man called James Bond? And I guess it just goes to show that people are going to stretch as far as they can to try and make this work on a linear timeline, and if you really have to do that to enjoy the series, then go ahead, I guess. But really, in an age where we have a film series like Marvel, where there are so many films and so many things are interconnected and references to past ones and the continuity is so tight and restrictive, the Bond series kind of exists as almost the antithesis of that.
Can I help you?
Yes, my name is Bond.
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 Bond. James Bond. What of it?
These films exist on a floating timeline, and I'm glad it does. I wouldn't necessarily want a 90-year-old playing James Bond in 2020, nor would I want the series to just have died in the 80s because the character was in his 50s. It's a brilliant thing that this series can exist by rejuvenating itself every decade or so, and a big reason why it can do this is by changing its lead actor, and I'm glad that we don't have to have some kind of arbitrary opening scene at the start of every new actor's tenure where they have to, like, get reconstructive surgery or something to explain their new facial features. Eon Productions have always said that they take the Bond series one film at a time, even when it comes to some of the stronger continuity elements of the Daniel Craig era. Producers Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman didn't sit down in 1962 and wonder what they were going to be doing with the films in 2020. As a series, Bond has always grown and adapted with the times. This is what has ensured his success, but he has always been James Bond and will continue to be James Bond for decades to come. One equal temper of heroic hearts, if you will. Thank you for watching episode 1 of the Myths of James Bond. If you have enjoyed this video, then please consider hitting the like button below, and if you've really liked this video, please consider hitting the subscribe button to stay up to date with the various updates on this channel, as well as future installments of the Myths of James Bond. Below you can also find links to my various social media pages, including my Facebook and my Twitter and my Patreon page, for those of you who wish to go one extra step in supporting this channel. Until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.